Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm Beth Parker with Pentegra. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box. We're going to hold all questions until the end, and if we don't have time at the end of the webinar, we will follow up with you afterwards. Be on the lookout for an email tomorrow with a link to replay today's broadcast. Let's get started. Hosting today is Chuck Caldwell, Vice President, National Director, Consulting and Bowlby Services. Chuck is going to lead us through a discussion on non-discrimination testing for your defined benefit plan. Welcome, Chuck. Thanks for being here today.
Well, thanks very much, Beth, and welcome again, everybody, to this afternoon's session. We always appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your busy afternoons to be part of these PENTalk discussions. So as Beth just mentioned, today's subject is a riveting one. It's annual non-discrimination testing in your defined benefit plan. And while it's probably not the most exciting topic, it is probably one of the more important ones when it comes to maintaining your defined benefit plans. I'm going to take about 30 minutes, and my goal today is to simply walk you through some of the testing requirements, what kind of data is being tested at the same time, and creating a strategy so that if you were to fail one or more of these tests, you know what kind of implications that has to your plan and what kind of strategies and steps you might want to take going forward. So this is an annual requirement by the IRS, and it basically says we want to look at the plan and make sure that it is not discriminating in favor of your highly compensated employees. And there are three primary tests. We look at minimum participation, minimum coverage, and general non-discrimination. And I'll walk you through each of those in a second. Highly compensated employees, that definition does generally change from year to year because it is based on salary in one respect. So we look back. So for 2022, that salary is $135,000. That will actually affect testing next year. Or if you're in top 20% of the employees of gross compensation or a 5% owner, those are your highly compensated employees. So what it ends up doing is it looks at the number of people covered by the plan. It looks at whether or not the population of employees benefiting from the plan is skewed towards highly compensated. And of course, it also wants to make sure that the benefits that are actually earned are not discriminating in favor of highly compensated. So I'm going to use an example. We have several different defined benefit plans here at Pentegra. Our largest is the multiple employer plan, and so I'm going to use that as an example, but this certainly applies. These concepts apply to your single employer plans too. So the multiple employer plan has a plan year July 1 to June 30. That's important because we test on the first day of the plan year, which is July 1. So most of you have probably seen over the summer, you got questionnaires from us asking you for data that we use as part of this whole testing process. So the first step is performed in August and September after the plan year ends. And one of the questions we ask on that questionnaire is if you were involved in any kind of audit or merger, because that could implicate these tests and the test results. So that's the first step. And just to put this in perspective, the first step tends to look at some of the simpler tests in each of these categories. And many of our clients pass through the first step, don't even have to go on to a second step. For those of you who are not passing the first step, the second step doesn't occur until next February or March because we have to use the calendar year 2022 of 401k data. And we can merge that data with the pension data, and that generally helps just about everybody pass. A couple other things to recognize: that if you do pass, technically you pass for the next 2 plan years as well. So I gave you an example here. If you pass the 7-1-22 test, theoretically you pass that year, 7-1-22, 23, and 24. you will find us testing anyways, just to make sure that we're not seeing any major demographic changes in these tests. One of the things that is important to recognize that if a test is failed, then corrective action must occur. And corrective action for a multiple employer plan using that July to June 30 plan year, that has to be in place, the corrective action, by April 15th of 2023 in my example. So I will talk about a little bit of this timing because it can turn into a Chinese fire drill depending upon what kind of failure occurs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So taking a step back, you understand that we have to run these tests annually. There's several tests that we look at. What could possibly contribute to a failed test? So what's typical in the client base is many of our clients maintain more than one benefit structure. And that happens when an employer decides, well, I've had this more liberal plan for a period of years, and going forward, I'm going to put my new hires in a less liberal plan. That is fairly typical. So now this employer has two benefit structures, and each of those benefit structures has to be separately tested. What happens if you have a high percentage of highly compensated employees participating versus a corresponding percentage of non-highlies? Well, the highly compensated will probably skew the results. So we look at that as well. And then I'm sure many of you have gone through what we'll call a soft freeze, where you're excluding new hires. So those people, as of a particular date, continue to earn benefits, but new hires don't. That particular set of circumstances has in the past caused some participation issues. Why? Because you have a dwindling group of benefiting employees as they terminate or retire, and you might fall below those minimum participation requirements. There is some good news on that front, however, given one of the recent pension laws. So the IRS boils down these three tests into categories. Minimum participation, I'm going to define each of these in a second, minimum coverage, and non-discrimination under those IRS codes. So we take a look at each of those, and we look at the rules, and then we look at the rules as applied to each of our employers' plans. So minimum participation is fairly straightforward. It says you've got to benefit the lesser of 50 employees or 40% of all your employees. All right, that's a fairly simple, straightforward test. I give you an example. If you had 200 bank employees, 40% of 200 is 80. If you have at least 50, you pass. Right? I mentioned a minute ago, you might have difficulty passing this if you went through a soft freeze. However, those rules have just changed, and it makes it a lot easier, if not for everyone, just about everyone, to pass this. Minimum coverage is a lot more complicated, and it has several stages to the test. There's a first step, second step, a third step, even a fourth step. The first step, and again, coverage is basically saying who's benefiting from the plan. And if it skews in favor of highly compensated, then we have an issue. So the first thing that we're going to look at is a very simple, straightforward percentage ratio test. We're going to look at the number of non-highlies benefiting from the plan versus total non-highlies versus the same percentage for highlies. Number of highlies benefiting versus total is going to come up with two percentages. If you fail that ratio percentage test, then we may be able to pass a second test called the average benefits test. And if you had a schematic diagram here, you would see that you're going off in one direction, yes, no. If it's a yes, you're done. If it's no, you go off in two other directions. And so the average benefit test says we have two parts. To pass it, we have to pass what's called a non-discriminatory classification test, and I'll define that in a second. And assuming we pass that, then we can go on to the average benefit percentage test. If we don't pass that second bullet, the ratio test, and then the fourth bullet, we don't pass the non-discrimination classification test, then we fail this, and we've got to take action. So let's look a little deeper dive at minimum coverage. I said a minute ago, there's 4 steps. All right, we look at the percentages, highlies and non-highlies who are benefiting. We take a ratio of the 2 percentages. So for example, if we determine that 60% of your non-highlies were benefiting, but 85% of your highlies were benefiting, we take 60 over 85, that determines a ratio test of 70.6. Okay? Next, we have to look at a concentration percentage, and we combine that with what the IRS uses as a safe harbor and an unsafe harbor percentage. That's a table in the IRS code. We have to use the table. So we apply that 70.6 to the table and see if we pass. If that 70.6 in our example exceeds the safe harbor percentage from the IRS's table, then we pass that first step. We pass the non-discrimination classification test, and we can proceed to the average benefit percentage test. It gets a little more complicated that if it falls in between a range in that IRS table, and technically it didn't pass, we can look at what's called a facts and circumstances as to what's happened in the demographics of the employee group. If it stayed stable, there's a good chance that we can use facts and circumstances to pass. Let's go all the way to a failure. If that ratio test falls below the unsafe harbor percentage, again, defined by the IRS, then you fail coverage, and we got to take action. So minimum coverage is a little more complicated, but there are several steps to it, and we have been able to get most clients to pass. So what happens if we pass that non-discrimination classification test, and we get to the average benefits part of this? What we're able to do here is really very beneficial to helping us pass minimum coverage, because it gets to roll in your 401k plan benefits if you have a 401k plan, and we combine the benefits of both plans. And what happens here? We're looking at the average combined benefits of the non-highly compensated group to the highly compensated, and we're converting all of the benefits under both plans to an average accrual rate. Now that's a little complicated too, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but that's what we end up doing to have an apples to apples comparison between a defined contribution benefit and a defined benefit plan. So I mentioned this earlier. If we have to get to this stage with somebody for the 7/1/22 testing of your defined benefit plan, we are using calendar year 22 401k benefits. So again, from a timing standpoint, we obviously don't know that till the end of the year. And that's why this particular test is run in February or March after we get all the 401k data. So just to take this one step further, when we look at 401k data, we are looking at employee money, whether it's pre-tax, Roth, and we're looking at the employer contributions, and we get to project them to age 65 at 8.5% interest. Well, guess what happens? If I'm a young employee in my 25s, 30s, we are projecting you from that age to 65. That's a long time that account balance can grow. And if I, which tends to happen at that age group, tend to be in the non-highly compensated group, I'm getting a very good account balance because of the amount of time I have between my current age and age 65. That really helps in this test. It boosts the 401k benefits to those non-highly compensated. We combine the two annuities, basically. We have to look at this individual divided by gross compensation. It gets, again, pretty complicated, but it boils all down to looking at the total benefits being earned by both groups, and then we compare them. So I'm making this overly simplified, but let's say we go through all of that And the average accrual rate for non-highly compensated employees, again, combining your 401k and pension together, is 15% of comp. The average accrual rate for highly compensated is 18%. We divide 15 into 18, that's 83%. The passing threshold as determined by the IRS was 73.5. This plan passes the average benefits percentage test. So if we have to go this far, and you are eligible to go this far, there is a great likelihood that this average benefit percentage test is passed because we get to roll in the 401k benefits. So that was the first two requirements: participation, coverage. And non-discrimination requirements, again, are looking at benefits accrued. And bottom line is we simply cannot discriminate in favor of your highly compensated employees. So how do we avoid non-discrimination? Well, the easiest way is to have one plan formula for all your employees. I can only tell you that based on our client base. I don't know about your own clients if you're an advisor, but most of our clients no longer have a single plan formula for everybody. Throughout the years, they have modified the design. New employees may have a different formula. I know I have two clients that have 4 different formulas based on 4 different hire dates. So once you've done that, you don't have a safe harbor design, so you can't automatically pass. If you have multiple plan formulas, then we have to test each of those benefit structures separately, and they each have to pass. If a structure does not pass, then we have to take action to correct and pass. So one way or the other, folks, if there's a failure, there is action that's going to be taken to make the plan pass. I want to put this in perspective again, that most of our plans are passing this, all right, and not having to take any action. But the purpose of talking to you today is, at some point in time, you may have a plan that's going to fail in the future. And we just want you to start thinking about the types of corrective action that you can take ahead of time. Because as I'm going to show you in a minute, there is a set of circumstances where you may not know whether you've passed these tests until March of a particular year. By April 15th, a month later, if you failed, you have to take corrective action. Think about if you need to go to a board to get board approval of taking action. Well, my advice here is that you as an organization discuss a potential failure and what kinds of actions you are willing to take to correct it, and that you get approval of that correction ahead of time. Because frankly, there's scenarios here where you're not going to have enough time to go to a board, get approval in order to take action. Right? I wanted to give you I know this is a little boring here and a lot of numbers, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an example here of non-discrimination requirements. So on the right-hand side, these are your totals for the entire organization. And the middle columns are telling you that we have 2 plan structures here, 2 different components. And they are benefiting different employees and different numbers of employees. But it's those numbers that matter. So remember, I've been talking about the number of benefiting employees. So my first component says I've got 108 total benefiting employees divided by non-Hileys and Hileys. I've got 43 non-Hileys and 65 Hileys. When I look at the ratio percentage, I'm looking at the ratios together, and you come up with 5 divided by 2. All right, line 5. Line 5 is saying I've got 43 non-Hileys benefiting. I've got a total on line 2 of 156 non-Hileys. So my benefiting ratio is at 27.56. Do the same thing for your Hileys. I got 45.7% participating. You can see the same math with the second component. All right, so this is determining the number of benefiting non-Hileys and benefiting Hileys. So I go on to the actual calculation here. And on the previous slide, you saw the line 7 and 8. And so now we're looking at the ratio test. 7 divided by 8 in both components come up with 60, a little over 60%, a little over 87%. Then we have to look at line 9 and compare it to the threshold as determined by the IRS. And if you're over the threshold, you're in good shape. If you're under, we need to do something different. Okay? And that's the point of this, is understanding, for those of you who have multiple benefit structures, just remember this. Don't you have to remember the math? Remember that we're testing both components separately. Both components need to pass. If one or more components don't, we have to take some action. So as you saw on that last slide, the ratio test was failed by one of the structures. We get to look at whether the average benefit test percentage is higher or lower than the safe and safe harbor percentages. If it's higher, then we pass and we're in good shape. If no, we're not quite done yet in terms of getting you to pass, but now we would have to look at something called a general test. And I'm not going to go into the general test in this particular discussion because it is very complicated. And I will tell you this, that the vast majority of our clients never have to get to the general test. So it's a rare performance, but it does give us one more avenue to pass non-discrimination requirements. If that fails, then once again, we're having to take some corrective action. So this is important here too, because I said a minute ago, you want to try and plan for a potential failure and what types of corrective action as an organization are you willing to undergo. So if you were to fail minimum participation, that was that lesser of 50 or 40% of your total employees, the only way to pass that is to add participants if you want to keep the plan going. You can always hard freeze, but let me tell you this. If you fail the test on July 1, 22, minimum participation, you can add people retroactively back to 7/1/22. You can't hard freeze the plan retroactively. So a hard freeze is prospective action. And that's one of those strategies that says, at the end of the day, if the only way I can pass this is to freeze the plan, then that's a decision I want to make ahead of time so that I'm not scrambling. But I'm going to come back to minimum participation because there is a caveat there. If coverage has failed, well, now we're talking about either adding some non-highlies to one or more of your benefit structures who might have been excluded, or you can always remove highly compensated employees. But once again, adding people is a positive, all right? That doesn't require a notice requirement. If you were to remove highly compensated people, that's a benefit reduction. And a benefit reduction requires either a 15 or a 45-day notice requirement. So you've got to build that into your time frame. Okay? If you've got multiple benefit structures, one way to correct any potential failures is to streamline the benefit structures. Remember, I just told you I have a couple of clients that have 4 benefit structures. Well, we're working with one of them right now to streamline them because they're having a problem with one of the benefit structures. So we will end up with perhaps 1 or 2 benefit structures, not 4. And a hard freeze, obviously, is always a last resort. Non-discrimination requirements, if you fail those, again, one benefit structure helps that test as well. And you can follow some of the other actions, corrective actions for minimum coverage that will work for non-discrimination as well. So that caveat I mentioned, you guys probably remember the fact that the Secure Act came out in December of 2019. We sent out a number of communications to clients summarizing what the act did. But that third bullet is really a very positive element of the Secure Act. And this has to do with minimum participation. Remember that 50 or 40% minimum. So minimum participation was becoming an issue for clients that soft froze the plan. That is, at some point in my life, we decided we're not going to add new hires to the plan. So that meant we had a finite group that was dwindling. And for smaller employers, that could dwindle below those 50 employees or 40%. And in the past, absent the Secure Act, you would have to add people to pass that test. Well, the Secure Act said, you know what? We recognize the fact that many plans are soft frozen. We don't want to hurt those that are still earning benefits. So the Secure Act says you no longer have to worry about minimum participation. There are some eligibility requirements that need to be passed, but for the handful of clients that have been impacted here at Pentegra, they've all passed the eligibility requirements. The other element that it greatly helped was it said we can now aggregate your pension and 401k plans, even if they have different plan years. Before the Secure Act, you couldn't do that if you had different plan years. You couldn't aggregate the two plans. And remember, aggregating them helps a great deal with minimum coverage. So that was good news, something that came out of Congress that really helped the testing aspect of your defined benefit plans. So where are we? Here's the conclusions I would draw. Yes, this is very complicated. It's why you have Pentegra doing the testing. There are 3 principal tests, but 2 of the tests have multiple layers. Minimum participation really isn't an issue anymore because of the Secure Act. Minimum coverage and non-discrimination, yes, we still have to deal with those. We're looking at benefits accruing to people and the number of people covered. For the multiple employer plan, 7/1 is the standard testing date. That's because the plan year is 7/1 to 6/30. If you have a single employer plan, obviously we need to look at your plan year and look at the first plan year date. Generally, we are looking at a snapshot. That's what this is called, snapshot testing. Look at the first day. You can look at a different day, and that is another alternative we have. If we did everything and we still couldn't pass 7/1, we could look at bringing in the participants that were enrolled during the year. If you are enrolling people, again, wouldn't help a soft frozen plan. But if you're enrolling new hires, we could look at those people too, collect additional data and rerun the test. That may or may not help, but we could do it. But here's my main message for today. Again, I want to put this in perspective, but most of our clients are passing these tests. But in the event you fail, you may have a timing issue for a correction. So knowing that that timing issue could be out there, all right, again, if we had to get you through the average benefits percentage test, and those results we're not going to know until February or March, and if you fail, you've got to correct by April 15th, basically a month or so later, you want to have a plan in place to know exactly what action you're going to take. And that's what I would take from this. One of the things that you don't have an option to do if you fail, because of the timing, I'm looking at the third bullet here, is to reduce highly compensated benefits or remove highly compensated people out of the plan. And that's because I mentioned to you before, depending upon the size of your organization, you may need a 45 or a 15-day notice requirement to take that action. Anytime you take something away, you need a participant notice. You always have the ability to add people. That's a benefit. All right? We don't need a notice requirement if you're adding people. Or shift people between your two benefit structures. All right? Typically what happens is the older benefit structure is more liberal. That tends to happen first at that benefit structure. The older one becomes an issue before the newer one. You can always shift people from the newer benefit structure into the higher, older benefit structure. That can help pass tests. There's a cost associated with it, so that's something you got to consider. But at the end of the day, this very last bullet to me is the message here. Most of you will pass these tests. But in the event that you don't pass, think ahead of time of a strategy of what actions you're willing to take in order to go through a correction. And I frankly would get some blanket approval from the board to put that in place if and when. Well, there I go. I took 30 minutes. I appreciate your attendance, your listening to this. Again, it is an important aspect of the health of your defined benefit plan is passing these tests. We'll have a new round of information in probably a month or so, actually maybe November, as the first step for non-discrimination testing of your multiple employer plan. So that's all coming. Anyways, thanks again for attending. If you have questions, you can send them in. We'll get to them and we'll respond later as a follow-up to this session. So thanks again for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.